Welcome to the Kennedy Report, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sorry about that delay. I'm having camera issues. Apple did this amazing update for their iPhones, and it worked amazing the last show I did. Actually, I've done a couple shows with it, the continuity camera, but it's not working right now. So I'm stuck using the good old Apple laptop camera, which is okay, but we like to deliver the best quality here over at TKR. So anyway, we're going to talk about the new mass. Is the new mass evil? It's kind of a loaded question. Do you have to go? There's a lot of questions in the chat already. We're going to go over the idea of what it would even mean for there to be a type of mass you wouldn't go to. What is the new mass? Why do people even say it's evil? Why does the Society of St. Pius X say you're not supposed to go? That's a question I get a lot. And I get these questions a lot. And then eventually I decide, you know what? I'm just going to talk about it on the internet for a while. And we're going to answer that as best as we possibly can. But first, we need to say thank you to our sponsor, Pray Latin. So, if you've ever wanted to pray in Latin, this is the place to go. Latin prayer cards from Pray Latin. They're Latin prayer cards to learn and share Catholic prayers in the sacred language, available in 4 formats: Latin pronunciation, Latin English, Latin Spanish, and Latin only. You can see here that they actually have phonetic spellings that help you say the words. So if you look here on the screen, you can actually see that it says in Latin, Piissima Virgo Maria, and then underneath that, it actually has it written as if you are just a good old gringo who can read and write, but not much else, especially in Spanish or another language, and it helps you understand that properly. So go to praylatin.com. Is it .com? Yeah, praylatin.com. And it's free shipping, over $35 for North America, essentially, and the international, $100 or more. It's free shipping. Go to praylatin.com. Thank you very much to our sponsors. Okay. So, the new mass. Do you have to go? Well, let's actually break this question down a little bit, because basically what happens is that people will discover tradition, and they'll discover the Society of St. Pius X. They'll discover tradition. They'll discover the ideas about liturgy, and then they'll come up to this idea that some traditionalists will say they won't attend the new mass, and they say, hold on a second here. I thought we were just supposed to go to mass on Sunday. Isn't it evil that you would never go to if there was only Novus Ordo, but you won't go? Isn't that missing the Sunday obligation? These kinds of things. And I want to answer a couple of questions in the chat before we get into this. So this person is asking, where do you think horrible, evil people like myself should attend mass? No one thinks you're horrible and evil. I have never had access to a TLM. You folks who have had access all your lives have no inkling what we go through. Actually, I haven't had access my whole life. And I drive very far to go to mass. But anyway. Okay, so before we even get into the exceptions about going to mass and so on and so forth, we have to break down a few concepts. For one, what is the mass? Well, the mass is the holy sacrifice of Calvary. Okay, it's not represented in a symbolic way, but it's represented to us. We're not in space and time 2,000 years ago in the same moment, but this moment is made present to us in some mystical way. So in a real sense, we actually are at Calvary, obviously, in a way that is presented to us in a different way, right? We're not actually living the same sensory experience, but we do exist at the holy sacrifice of Calvary. It's a very mystical thing. The new mass is a valid liturgy. Everywhere that there is a valid sacramental consecration of the Eucharist to take place, this is valid. There's no question there. In fact, Marcel Lefebvre signed a document with Cardinal Ratzinger in 1988 attesting to that, so there's no issue as far as that's concerned. But once we get beyond this idea of validity, there's actually a lot more to it. Because just think for a second here. People will say, well, what's wrong with this mass? It's valid. Well, at the beginning of the Protestant Reformation, there were Protestant masses that were valid, assuming they did the same, form, matter, and intent, and they were ordained priests. That happened for a while. In fact, the Church of England had valid masses for maybe 200 years. I don't know the exact number, but it was for a while. Um, I think even the Lutherans had valid masses for a while. So validity is a very low bar. A valid priest says the proper words over the proper form, with the form and the substance and so on and so forth. Form, matter, and intent. This is pretty easy. But then we have to ask ourselves, well, if it's not just about validity, what is it about? Because the Eucharist at the Mass is not simply, I think Father Ripperger has said the priest is not a Eucharistic Pez dispenser. It's not like getting a vitamin where kind of no matter what you do, it's just going to have this effect on you and you just take it because it's like, take your vitamins. There's a lot more to receiving Holy Communion than just that. We have to be predisposed in order to receive the full benefits of Holy Communion. When we receive Holy Communion, we might say, for example, there is a potentiality that is there waiting to be unleashed. So in order to do that, we have to try to receive Holy Communion in a state of receptivity to the graces that could be present by us receiving such a sacrament. So if that is the case, then we would have to be predisposed for that. So just think for a second. If whether you go to the new Mass, the old Mass, whatever, or Eastern liturgy, when do you think you'd have a more efficacious reception of Holy Communion? Do you think it would be, if you were out for your morning jog and you just kind of stopped into a church just after the consecration and went up and, received the Eucharist and ran out? Would that be an efficacious reception? This is a silly example, but you see my point here. Compared to, you've been fasting, you've been reading some spiritual literature, you've been hearing Gregorian chant or some sort of Eastern chant, you have been in a situation where the incense, the smells and bells, which are not just superfluous, they're not just superfluous. They're there to lift our hearts and minds to God. Everything is working towards that. And then at this pinnacle moment in a liturgy that you've been following along with and you've been praying with, you get to the point where now it is your opportunity to partake in a very special way with the sacrifice at Calvary. Okay. Obviously, this is an easy answer. Which one of those two scenarios is better? Well, there are varying degrees of how we might be worthily prepared to receive. And these things are not just negligible. We've been so beaten down by, the watered down, terrible, sacrilegious liturgical things that have become so normal that, we're in this position where Catholics of goodwill will say things like, what's the problem? It's valid. Again, a Protestant Mass at one time was valid. A Satanist Mass could be valid as long as there's a valid priest. Validity is a very low bar. Validity, it's like, the priest breathes, the priest breathes, the priest eats food, and the priest validly consecrates the Eucharist. I know it's, we're not saying that it's a mundane act, but I'm saying for a valid priest, it's a very low bar for that to happen. Okay. He says the, proper words with the proper intention, the proper matter. It happens. It happens despite him in a sense. I mean, he's an alter Christus and it's the power of God working through him. So there's much more to the liturgy than just validity. This is a fact. So we have to ask ourselves then, okay, well, what more is there? Is it just smells and bells? Is it just architecture? Is it just decorations? Is it just the setting? Is it just fasting? I mean, really, it's all of these things. It's all of these things. Now, of course, in various circumstances around the world, you're going to be in different churches. You're going to have different artistic customs and so forth. So those things are obviously a little bit, malleable depending on certain things. However, there's a reason why the church has always insisted, or at least to the best of her ability, depending on the circumstance, insisted on uniformity of the particular liturgies. It's so that there is no risk of there being a defective or inefficient or deficient or dangerous theology. imbibed in the people. If you pick up your missal, if you pick up your Roman missal and you compare the new mass to the old mass, they're clearly in different universes. It's not just translated into English or Spanish or Italian, whatever language you go to mass in. It's a completely different liturgy as far as the expressed intention based on the types of prayers that are said, the spiritual atmosphere that it creates for the person, the profundity of the nature of sacrifice. I mean, you follow these things through and you find yourself in very different liturgical settings. This is why in the new mass, in most cases, there has been a Protestant spirituality that has imbibed itself. This is not something you have to have a PhD to understand. In fact, PhDs are probably not as commonsensical about these sorts of things. But the new mass has a Protestant spirit imbibed in it. This is part of the formation of it. This is part of the formulation of the new mass. This is part of the history books. The folks at Mass of the Ages showed this, but this was seen long before in the works of Michael Davies. This is why Archbishop Lefebvre warned against going to the new mass, because what it did is it imbibed a Protestant spirit. And why is that? Because the emphasis in the new mass liturgical framework is on the community, and it is on the corporal nature of people being there, experiencing some sort of thing where they are part of the mystical body of Christ. That's the emphasis. Think about the Eucharistic prayers and the prefaces and things that you've heard. Now compare that to the old mass, where it's about sacrifice, it's about atonement, it's about all the different realities of why mass is done. So that's baseline. So that's why we have to contrast these two liturgies. And we need to understand those things before we would even consider the question of, well, should you avoid it? Because avoiding something is about whether or not that thing is going to be harmful to you. Avoiding something is about whether or not that thing is going to be of advantage or disadvantage to you. So let's just think of an example for a second. If you lived in a city and there were two parishes and both of them were Novus Ordo, but that's all you had, and you were okay with going to the Novus Ordo. One of them was, insert, sacrilegious, irreverent mass with Father Bob, who likes to have liturgical dancers and, rock guitars up on the altar or something. I don't know. These things happen. And the other one is just your average parish priest who just does a decent job. It's just your basic hymnal that he's just singing from. Nothing to write home about, but it's not some sort of wacky, blasphemous affair. Well, you're going to choose to go to one over the other. That's just a fact, Why is that, though? They're both the same mass. They're both valid. Why don't you just why would you ever make a distinction between the two? Why would you ever avoid one and go to the other? It's an obvious answer. In the one setting, it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to dispose yourself for a worthy reception of Holy Communion. In the other setting, it's going to be much more doable. Now, let's just say over time, this idea, you've got these two parishes in your city, the only ones you can go to, everything else is a 3-hour drive or something. And it's always like rock and roll liturgical dancer mass or your average Novus Ordo parish. And let's just say you're traveling. And for some reason, where you're traveling to, it's also 2 or 3 hours from the closest parish, or you didn't even really know where other parishes were. You're just traveling and you look up mass and you walk in and they're doing rock and roll liturgical dancer mass, and you find out that it's, that priest from your hometown also took a vacation and he's at the parish and the only place you're going to. So your only option is to go to this place where it's going to be a blasphemous, sacrilegious affair. But it's the only mass you can go to. Do you stay? Do you sit there while they play the rock and roll guitars, while they have the liturgical dancers, while Father Bob does his social justice sermon? Is it really a good thing that you go to mass? uh, in a setting where you're pretty certain that it's an offensive setting. It's a setting that's going to scandalize your children. It's going to make you angry. Can you receive Holy Communion worthily if you're angry at the priest? I mean, these are all things that one must consider. And the reason I bring this up, but before even getting to the idea of, how could you discount one liturgy? How could you count out one liturgy over, compared to another? I think everyone with common sense can say, yeah, if I showed up and it was like electric guitars and blasphemous, sacrilegious stuff, I'd probably just leave. You wouldn't be sinning by leaving. Okay, so let's break this down even further. Where does the idea that you attend Mass every Sunday even come from? This idea comes from the Ten Commandments, where you sanctify the Lord's Day. So before there is the holy sacrifice of the Mass, there is the liturgical history of the Hebrews. And there was the temple, but there were also synagogues. And there were ways that the Jews would satisfy the sanctification of the Lord's Day. And the normal means was by synagogue or the temple. Clearly, there can be exceptions to that. If you're traveling and there is no, in the old sense, a synagogue or the temple, there was only one temple. In our modern day, if there is no Mass around, you're not sinning by not going, but you're still required to sanctify the Lord's Day. And in fact, in a sense, there is even an exception to this idea that you have to sanctify the Lord's Day, because, I don't know, actually, we see this in Maccabees, where the group of the Jews are actually slaughtered because they decide not to fight back on the Sabbath. And then they realize, no, we can actually fight back on the Sabbath, even though going to war isn't really how we sanctify the Lord's Day. There's a hierarchy of needs in the human being, and you're not required to have your head cut off and be martyred just to sanctify the Lord's Day. Although if it does come, I mean, if you're like one of those Christians in Africa who sadly are, or I guess in a glorious sense, are martyred on Easter, if it happens, fine, but you don't have to invite that on yourself. So we have this precept of sanctifying the Lord's Day. Normally speaking, in the church, we have these precepts of the church. You're supposed to go to Mass on Sundays and holy days of obligation. But even there are exceptions. You can have exceptions if you're sick. You can have exceptions if you have to take care of a family member who's ill, or little children or something. If you have to work, you're a bus driver and once a month you have to work on Sundays. That's just part of the routine, the schedule, and this is how you support your family. You can figure all these things. All things being considered, you're still supposed to try to sanctify the Lord's Day on those days. But you're not sinning if there's a reason why you can't go to the Mass for some sort of impossibility, some sort of physical impossibility, health, whatever. So we've established that clearly there are exceptionalities of going to Mass. And they're physical and they are moral. In the first example we talked about, there is the moral impossibility of going to Mass. This idea that, yeah, you're certain it's going to be a blasphemous affair and there's no other place around and you're just not going to go. You wouldn't be sinning by not going. And why is that? Well, canon law actually says that's the case. But even besides that, we don't need canon law. The reason is because what is the point of going to Mass? So Mass is offered by the priest because the Mass is offered for various reasons: sacrifice, repentance, atonement, that sort of thing. But why do we attend? We attend because that's the way, normally speaking, that we sanctify the Lord's Day. We don't attend. The precept of the church has never been, you have to receive every Sunday and holy day of obligation. We don't go to Mass in order to receive Holy Communion as a rule. That's not the case. You don't have to receive as a rule. You're supposed to receive once during Easter time as per the church law. So it's not even like we're going because we are required to receive Holy Communion. The reason why we're required to attend Mass, normally speaking, is to sanctify the Lord's Day. So the purpose of that law is to serve the highest law, which is to sanctify the Lord's Day, to keep the Sabbath holy. Well, if for some reason following a lower law would require you to endanger or break a higher law, you aren't required to fulfill the lower precept. Christ demonstrates this to us. Why is it that they're allowed to pick some food on the Sabbath? Well, because it's very hard to sanctify the Sabbath if you're starving. Why is it you can get your ox out of a ditch, even though it's servile work? Because you don't have to let your ox die and lose your living as a farmer in order to sanctify the Lord's Day. There are exceptionalities. And Christ is demonstrating this to us in the New Testament, that it is not as if the divine laws of the Bible, it's not as if they're not infallible, but we have a world where we use common sense and reason, and it would be impossible for a human author, it'd be too onerous, for them to enumerate every possible exception that could fall under the exceptionalities of a law that could happen in all of history. We see this with King David when he consumes, I think it's the bread of the presence, even though he's not a priest. Perhaps you remember the story in the Old Testament. I can't remember where it is. I just remember reading it. But I know that when I've read, this is one of those examples where they give an example of an exception even to divine positive law. The laws of Moses about the liturgical norms, the divine positive law, there are even exceptions to that. And why is that? Because the purpose of the priesthood in the Old Testament is to consume the sacrifice. If the priest is not present, the sacrifice still must be consumed. Therefore, David does not transgress a law by consuming that sacrament. That wasn't a sacrament. That sacrifice, excuse me. That sacrificial offering when no priest was present, because the point is for it to be consumed. That's the nature of sacrifice. The nature of sacrifice is realized when there is a consumption. Therefore, there is an exception to divine positive law in an exceptional circumstance. It doesn't break any moral precept to do so. Okay. So those things all have to be considered before we even approach the idea of why would some traditionalists say they're just not going to go to the new Mass? And I know a lot of people ask questions. There's been hundreds of comments already. I'm not even looking at the comments right now because I'll get sidetracked. After I'm done going over the traditionalist position about why they wouldn't go to the Novus Ordo Missae as a rule, then please ask questions again that you've already asked, and I promise I'll get to them. We'll go for about 25, 30 more minutes. So, why would someone even say they're going to avoid the Novus Ordo as a rule? And please, no sensitivities here. This is not about any individual person's decision to go to any particular liturgy. Everyone can put on their, big boy pants or their big girl skirts and make decisions for themselves. If you're comfortable with what you do, that's your decision. But I'll tell you why traditionalists, especially from the Society of St. Pius X, don't go to the new Mass as a rule. It is because, as I mentioned earlier, there is a Protestant spirit that is imbibed in the new Mass. And this is not just conjecture. This was baked into the cake. Again, go watch Massive Ages, episode 2. That's nothing new in that documentary, but it's wonderfully laid out. So you don't have to go read some big books. You can see the Coles notes there. But if you want to, go read Michael Davies' series on the liturgy. I believe it's a trilogy. The new Mass is a combination of the Anglican Cranmer service, the Lutheran evangelical service, and there was even Jewish table blessing prayers in there. That's what it is. It retains a valid sacrifice, a valid sacrament with the proper form, matter, and intention. But it is in its extrinsic reality, not intrinsic. It is intrinsically a Mass. The holy sacrifice takes place with valid priests, the proper setting, as I said. But it is extrinsically, meaning in the externals, it is a Protestantly imbibed reality. That's just a fact. This is why everything in the church looks Protestant now, generally speaking. It's funny. There's actually this movie coming out called Jesus Revolution or something like that. It's with Kelsey Grammer, who was a funny actor. He was in that show Frasier for a lot of years. And it goes over this revival that happened in these Protestant churches, this Protestant church in the 1960s, where basically they went hippie and then everyone came back and all the youth came back and they played guitars and it was all about like emotions and stuff. And it's like this glorious thing where they embrace this way of reaching the young people. Um, To be honest, I think that's what they were hoping for at the Second Vatican Council with the new mass. After the Second Vatican Council with the new mass, I think they were hoping for the hippie Jesus thing to take off. It never did. But my point is, it is a Protestant paradigm. So, what is Protestantism? Well, Protestantism is a heresy. It's a bunch of different heresies, but it's not Catholic. We believe as Catholics traditionally that there's no salvation outside the church. So we wouldn't want to imbibe in ourselves a spirit of heresy that would lead us to leave the church. And again, you can debate the internal intentions of people that are not Catholic and salvation. I'm actually pretty easygoing with that. I would like more people to be saved than not. I'm not here to argue anyone out of salvation in the most strict sense letter of the law. I'm just saying the basics are what I've expressed. So is it wise to go to something if you've been convinced that that thing presents an obstacle or presents a spirit that is an obstacle to your salvation? That's the logic of it. So people will ask me, for example, well, I don't think the same thing about the liturgy, so I have no problem with the Novus Ordo. That's probably true, and that's your decision. I didn't used to think the way that I think now. In fact, when I was going to the um, even when I was going to the Society of St. Pius X in the early bit, I remember I did go to a new mass once because we had some sort of obligation. After that, we decided never to go again. That was more for an experiential reason. But then I did a lot of reading about the reality of the mass, the new mass, and I really did my homework. And I actually remember reading Cranmer's Godly Order, which was about the Anglican Revolution, and I was struck by how it was like reading this thing about Cranmer's Godly Order and what the Anglicans did, and then reading about what they did with the new mass. It was like they were overlaying on each other. It was the same thing. And I saw that, viscerally for what it was. And I thought, well, this Anglican revolution is built on basically hatred of the church. Cranmer was, he was an enemy of the church, to say the least. And this is his service. And then the one that they're giving us in the Catholic Church looks like that one. And, there were Protestants who were part of the formation of that service. It's like, well, clearly there's an animus behind this thing. Again, that doesn't make it invalid. It's just a fact. And then I looked into what Martin Luther said about the Mass and all of the innovations that he did, communion on the hand, the vernacular, these kinds of things, and the intentionality behind those, the table altars and so forth. And you just get into it. And I went, oh my goodness, this is the new Mass. This spirit of resistance to tradition, protestation against the history of the church, this Protestant spirit is the animating force behind the reforms of the new Mass. This is a matter of historical record. This is not, we can't go in this in complete depth here. Once you realize that, once you come to believe that, how can you go to that? How can you attend that thing? Again, going back to this idea of we attend the Mass to sanctify the Lord's Day. We don't attend Mass primarily to receive the Eucharist. We don't have to every time. We attend Mass in order to sanctify the Lord's Day. I would never go to a Protestant service and say that fulfilled my Sunday obligation. I'm not saying that the Novus Ordo Mass is technically a Protestant service, meaning it's not a valid Mass. I don't believe that. And there are some people who will say, well, this sounds like it's against the Council of Trent, because the Council of Trent says somewhere, I think it's session 22, that basically if you say that the church can, I think this is pretty much the exact wording. I'm paraphrasing a bit though, but if the church can promulgate a liturgy that is an affront to piety or a cause for impiety, let him be anathema. People will say, well, how can you say this? Well, what the Council of Trent is talking about with piety, it doesn't mean like, pious ears, you know, um, you know, he's a pious man. It means piety as in an act of religion. If you look up in St. Thomas Aquinas, this is what piety means. This is why it is true that the Novus Ordo is a valid act of religion because it has a valid consecratory formula. So no, this does not break the tenets of the Council of Trent, but the externals are Protestant. The externals are an affront to piety in a lower sense. The externals present themselves as a heretical spirit that has been imbibed in the church. So when you understand these things, how can you attend it if that's what you believe? In the same way that I'm not going to go to Father Bob's, electric guitar. That's an easy example. If James Martin is in town and he's doing his thing, and that's the only mass to go to, are you going to bring your kids? I mean, honestly, if it's, Pachamama service. I remember when I used to go to the cathedral in the city I grew up in. I remember one time being there, and it was actually like an interfaith tree planting thing. Like that didn't happen during the liturgy, but they were going on and on about this, and the different ministers were there. And they were talking about how they were going to go and plant some sacred tree after with the Anglicans. I remember that happened. This is a cathedral. Uh, if I was in a situation like that now and I didn't know what was happening and I didn't know that was going to happen, I would just get up and leave. I'm not going to stick around for that. Are you kidding me? Are we really under the impression that that's going to be, do we think that's not offensive to God? Really? Do we want to be a part of something? Now, someone will say, well, you're not formally participating in it. Well, if you present yourself for Holy Communion and join in the activities of the Mass by going along with everything that's happening, I don't know what that, I mean, I don't know if does that technically count as formal cooperation with the heresy and this sacrilege? Maybe you could argue not, but it's definitely an external manifestation of your active assent or consent to the act that's happening. Also, one more thing before there's lots of unread comments here. It is the case right now. And I remember talking to a Eastern Catholic friend of mine. I don't know if he's watching this right now. I won't say his name in case he doesn't want me to say his name. I don't think he had an issue with it. But we were talking on messaging back and forth. Because I remember reading somewhere in the Eastern Code of Canon Law that essentially it says in the Eastern Code of Canon Law, because they use a different Code of Canon Law. And by the way, in the Eastern Code of Canon Law, they don't have late sententia excommunications. That's the whole Marcel Lefebvre question. So people act like it's this thing that's binding in perpetuity. The Eastern Code doesn't even have it. So it's not even universal. Anyway, it says you're required to go to, basically you're required to go to an Eastern rite. You're required to go to your rite on Sundays and holy days of obligation. So I asked my friend and I said, does this mean that if there's no Eastern liturgy available, do some Eastern Catholics not go, but it's only the Novus Ordo, do they abstain from going to the Novus Ordo and then instead do something else, even if they can't go to Mass? And he said, and he sent me some information. He said, it seems like in some cases that's the case. Many will go to both. That's their choice. But there is a diversity of how that's interpreted. And he sent me some information from I believe it was a Ruthenian church. And I did a little bit of digging and I found that it is often the case in the West, outside of Eastern Europe, where there is no Eastern Catholic option or Eastern Orthodox. I know that the Orthodox and Eastern Catholic are not the same, but there's an analogy here. And Instead, they'll have a deacon lead a vespers, or they just do vespers on their own, even if they could go to a new mass instead, because it's not the same rite. And it's not how they understand how they would sanctify the Lord's Day as an Eastern Catholic. But they're not sinning by not going to Mass, as long as they're sanctifying, because there is an exceptionality. As part of the Eastern Church, they're owed the sacraments in the Eastern Rite. And if they're not there, then they seek for other means, essentially, to sanctify the Lord's Day. So these things, even today in the church, there are Catholics who would be not in any dubious canonical standing, who would have permission from some sort of Eastern authority that they don't have to go to the Novus Ordo and instead could, pray a Vespers service instead. Okay. So if people say to you, you have to go to the new Mass if there's no traditional Mass around, that's not true. You're not required, under pain of mortal sin, to attend any Mass if there's an exceptionality. Now, I'm not trying to get out of the Sunday obligation here and give people a way out. I'm just trying to say this is the logic of it. And I will buttress my point here just real quick. I'm going to go to Canon 844 of the Code of Canon Law. I've talked about this before, but just so you know, this is not just, I was trying to explain this. I don't like to get into the whole canons thing. It just becomes like a tit for tat. I can use my canon against yours, but this canon explains exactly what I'm talking about. Okay. So the Code of Canon Law, 844. It says the following. It says, wherever necessity requires it or true spiritual advantage suggests it, and provided that danger of error of indifferentism is avoided, the Christian faithful for whom it is physically or morally impossible to approach a Catholic minister are permitted to receive the sacraments of penance, Eucharist, and anointing of the sick from a non-Catholic minister in those churches those sacraments are valid. It's a lot there. Basically, and I'm not saying I agree with everything in this canon, because the subsection 4 of this canon is actually pretty scandalous. But look at the language here. True spiritual advantage suggests it. So right there, this is actually pretty good. I mean, the law is concerned with the true spiritual advantage in this case. Why is that? Well, because you have to be in a good spiritual place to go to heaven. So spiritual advantage is not just, again, we've been so beaten down by the terrible, so beaten down by the terrible liturgical nonsense that, for so many, I remember being at these conferences, and how many times did I hear the speakers, people would ask, hey, how do you get your kids to go to Mass? And the speaker would say, listen, I know, the music's terrible and the sermons are boring and, blah, blah, blah. And everyone kind of roll their eyes, but it's like, but it's the Mass. You gotta tell your kids it's the Mass and then go, and I was good natured and everything. But I remember thinking to myself, why are we so okay with just, how did we get to this point where we've just resigned ourselves to the fact that we're going to expect bad liturgy and heresy? I mean, that's really messed up. So I think we've become almost so indifferent in a sense, almost as a survival mechanism. But Code of Canon Law, it talks about, when necessity requires it. So necessity is relative, or true spiritual advantage requires it, suggests it. This is relative. You can even go to a non-Catholic minister. Now, I'm not even saying do that. Now, it says here for physical and moral impossibility. What does that mean? Well, physical impossibility is what we talked about. You're sick. It's physically impossible for you to go to Mass, to approach a Catholic minister, right? That would include going to Mass. Moral impossibility means there's an affront to a true spiritual advantage. This is the same example of the Father Bob analogy with his heavy metal liturgical dancer mass. There's no chance of a true spiritual advantage there because you're going to want to clobber everybody by the time it's go up for Holy Communion, or you're going to be weeping the whole time. And it's morally impossible for you to take part in it. In that case, the church says, for true spiritual advantage, you could even seek out a priest who's not Catholic. I'm not saying do anything of the sort. But if it's saying there's a moral impossibility to approach a Catholic minister, that implies that there's a moral impossibility that you could just not go to that minister, meaning you just would have to not go to that place, which could mean hypothetically not going to mass that Sunday if there is a moral impossibility in your way, or if there is a spiritual advantage to not going. Think about it this way. You know, if you're traveling and the only mass that's going on is Slim Jim Martin's mass, it's a spiritual advantage for you because of moral impossibility to not go at all. Because you will be getting no spiritual advantages out of going to Slim Jim Martin's, Eucharistic revival. Let's put it that way. Okay, I think I've droned on enough about this topic. Let's take some questions. There's like 100 questions. Okay, so if I ask your questions, ask your questions at the bottom. Ask them again if there's anyone. Okay, so what is this? No, so Patty, you're wrong here. Saying means going to a schismatic church when no Catholic one is available. It does not excuse you from mass because you don't like the Novus Ordo. No, it doesn't talk about the Novus Ordo at all. It talks about there being a moral impossibility, and it doesn't define what that is. So that's not true at all what you're saying. And it also talks about true spiritual advantage. So spiritual advantage is positive and negative. It is spiritually advantageous to avoid blasphemy and heresy. It is spiritually advantageous to go to a good liturgy. And it's not about preference. It's not about, I like this one better than the other. For example, personally, if there was an Eastern Catholic liturgy around, or a Novus Ordo, I would 100% go to the Eastern Catholic liturgy because I would not be worried about there being an imbibing of a Protestant spirit, especially for my children, because it's clearly not. They haven't been. I mean, there's modernism in the East for sure, but at least the externals are still clearly Catholic. So Robert Ryan asks, would you do a show on Medjugorje? Well, to be honest, that's a difficult one, and I'm going to say why I'm actually hesitant to do a show on it. There's lots of information out there about Medjugorje that is pretty it's pretty convincing, for a position that is contrary to those who love it. But I also know that it's not really a hill I want to die on as far as what I'm trying to do here with this channel. I don't know. There's just lots of really good people who like Medjugorje, and I don't really think Medjugorje is a good thing. But out of all the metaphorical sacred cows that I like to go after, for some reason I'm just not motivated to go after that one, if that makes sense. So, have any of you ever been? Traditional Thomas says, have any of you ever been to the traditional Dominican Mass? Very beautiful. I have never been, but actually, interesting story. Even though they didn't change the traditional Dominican Mass after Vatican II, you can find examples of local bishops restricting traditional Dominicans from celebrating it if they didn't do the Novus Ordo. So there was definitely an agenda there. Jack says, as the church gets smaller and the TLM is harder to find, what orders and rites are acceptable? Well, I mean, acceptable meaning valid. Any valid priest says a valid mass. as long as he does it properly. Um, I think the TLM is getting harder to find in a relative sense, but I think it's actually going to keep growing. Um, if you live in a situation where there's literally nothing around for hours and hours, that's awful. I feel for you. Um, but I think basically the underground church is in a parallel sense. There's going to be something like an underground church that's going to continue to grow. So I think that's going to happen. Um, what is your opinion on the two Lucias? I don't believe there's a fake Sister Lucy, but I also haven't looked into it too deeply. Father Grunner, I worked for the Fatima Center, and Father Grunner was adamant that there was not two Lucies. Father Grunner was not right about absolutely everything, but when it came to the historicity of the Fatima things, I think he was, borderline infallible on that stuff. He had an encyclopedic knowledge. Him and John Venari, that was just, impeccable. So whether they had different conclusions about, how to interpret the secret and all those, that's fine. That's up for debate. But as far as the historicity, he was second to none, and he was pretty adamant there was no Sister Lucy. So yeah, so this is one too. I went through a period where I could not get to my traditional Latin mass. Probably typo there. My traditional priest told me I still had to go to mass and offer it up. Yeah, see, I've heard that before. I would challenge that priest respectfully. I wouldn't actually want to go challenge a priest, but the reason I would do that is offer what up? What does it mean to offer it up? Uh, Now, if people believe that they don't want to go to the Novus Ordo because it doesn't vibe with them, that's really just a matter of subjective preference. That's not a principled stance. If somebody believes that the Novus Ordo presents a near occasion for a heretical spirit, well, that's a completely different story. Let's try to use another example. Okay, Patty Leather, you're getting annoying. I'm going to have to put you in timeout for a bit. If you look at an examination of conscience, right, it will say things like, did you spend time in lewd company? Or did you read any bad books or watch any bad movies or something like that? It's pretty vague. There's varying gradients of bad. But there are reasons why you would have to be around bad company, maybe. Because being around bad company isn't. There are reasons why you might have to be around bad company, and it's not going to be an affront to your salvation. Maybe you just have to work with people that are, they're all potty mouths or something, or making bad jokes. There's really nothing you can do about it. And in that sense, you might say, well, offer it up. But the liturgy is not supposed to be something where you simply suffer through it, even though evil things are going on around you. It's not what's supposed to happen. In fact, that's an affront against the very purpose of liturgy, in a sense. So if a priest believes that going to the new mass is something you have to offer up, he's saying that there's something deficient, offensive, troubling. Why would he tell you to go to a mass that's troubling, deficient, or offensive? Unless he is of the opinion that it's really just a preference. Like, if they took away all the TLMs tomorrow, that would suck, but oh well. That's not the position of the Society of St. Pius X. That's not the position of traditionalists in general. So I would challenge the priest's logic on that. Al Smith says, hello from the Great White North. Al, what a beauty. Check out my interview with Al the other day. We talked about Fulton Sheen. He's a Fulton Sheen expert. He has a Bishop Sheen Today Society. Kennedy, how can I support your work? By sending you a few euros. If you go to the kennedyreport.com, I haven't put it in the description right at the moment, but the kennedyreport.com, there is a donate button. That's very kind. Thank you. Teresa, I had memorized and followed the consecration. How is that bad? I don't know what that means. Maybe if you want to clarify that again, I can answer that. If you're just joining us right now, we talked about sort of the basics of what is liturgy, what would make a good liturgy a bad liturgy, what would be the stipulations where you wouldn't go. And there's one fellow in the chat kept saying, you have to go no matter what. You have to go no matter what, because it's Catholic or something like that. That's not the case. Again, there are many exceptions where you could say, I'm just not going to go. Any more questions, ladies and gentlemen? I've got a few more minutes before I've got to get out of here. I suggest reading Michael Davies' trilogy on the liturgy. He lays out all these things in much more detail than I can. There's also a talk called, I believe it's by Father Franks, who is a Society of St. Pius X priest. I believe it's called something like Why I'd Rather Die Than Say the New Mass. Oh man, this Patty. See, I don't like to block people for reasons of having different opinions, but of being thick-headed or annoying is one reason. I have to put you in a timeout again. Al, thanks for sharing the Fulton Sheen videos. You're welcome. Always great to share Fulton Sheen videos. Yeah, this is right. Traditional Thomists, The Problem of Liturgical Reform by sspx priests. And again, these are in a sense, these are very subjective realities. You know, personally, I would never participate. Oh, there was a question at the beginning. I remember someone asked, what if you have a Catholic family and one of your family members asks you to be in the wedding and it's a new mass? Would you go? So I would attend a new mass for reasons of charity. I wouldn't participate in the mass. And this is a position that many traditionalists have. And again, there's no argument against that. There's nothing that says that you must actively participate in a mass or somehow you're a bad person. Okay. You're supposed to attend mass on Sundays and holy days of obligation. So for example, if I had a family member who was going to get married, I would go. I just wouldn't receive communion and I wouldn't partake in the liturgy in an active sense. I'd be there. Also, though, a wedding would not be, a wedding mass would not also be part of your Sunday obligation anyway, so that wouldn't be the same question. But participation in the mass is different. Al says, what is your position on visiting a perpetual adoration chapel in a Novus Ordo parish? So again, the only reason why traditional priests say to avoid the new mass is because of the religious indifferentism of the Protestant spirit. That's the main reason. But adoration is, it is possible. I'll put it this way: the worst thing that could happen with perpetual adoration chapel would be an invalid host, but it's extremely unlikely that at a place where they put perpetual adoration as a front and center kind of thing, that the priests would not have the proper intention. I mean, that's like, I'm talking about, I would never even argue that that's the case. That'd be the only thing I could think of off the top of my head. But personally, I mean, Yeah, if I would go to a perpetual adoration chapel at a Novus Ordo church or chapel, yeah, I would for sure. Um, I might not bring my kids. No, I mean, it depends. I mean, there's also a difference between the way of doing adoration in the Novus Ordo sense as far as the ceremony is concerned. I haven't been to one in so long. I can't remember if it's as Protestant looking as the new mass. But anyway, yeah, that's a long-winded way of saying the spirit of Protestantism, there'd be no danger in that of just kneeling in front of the Holy Sacrament, adoring Christ, you know. Um, okay. Once someone asked, do you know any traditional books that talk about the hermeneutic of continuity versus rupture? I actually those two things together, I don't know. I'm sorry, I don't actually know together. Um, and yes, loyal Catholic says you don't need to attend a mass that is detrimental to the faith. Yeah, that's kind of the crux of it. Oh, loyal Catholic says I've seen a baptism with a water gun. Yeah, that's pretty bad. I've never seen that. You know what's funny? I never actually. I mean, I gave that little story about the sort of eco service thingy, but that was really rare. Like to be honest, my experience with the new mass was pretty run of the mill. It was never massively scandalous on every occasion. That wasn't why I sought out tradition. I just sought out tradition because I just wanted tradition. But that wasn't. But I've obviously heard crazy stories. Um, so what do you think about the Nova Ad Orientem Novus? Basically, the traditional Novus Ordo. Uh, the Protestant spirit is in the text of the Latin Novus Ordo. It's not about the translation. It looks better, but it's not in a technical sense. And is there a third order of the sspx? Yes, there is. God willing, I'll make my pledge in December after a year of whatever postulancy. Here's another thing as well. Tired of the immodesty dress women in the mainstream church. I mean, that's a real thing to consider. I mean, again, if there's no modesty at your parish, that's a grave occasion of that's a potential occasion of grave sin. That's a reality, you know? So, I mean, these aren't little things to just brush aside and offer it up. You don't offer sin up. You don't offer occasions for sin up. That's not a thing. Okay. Sarah says, how do I gently tell family members that I don't feel comfortable attending the Novus Ordo? I actually have never had that problem because my family aren't practicing Catholics. But I know people where it's been very difficult for them. Um, I guess it would depend on how much they know. You know, if they're like really gung ho about the new mass and they've really bought into the spirit of Vatican II and they're like reading books on it and stuff and have all their arguments, that's going to be a different thing. If it's more of they just go to a Sunday mass and they're good Catholics and never really thought about it and are just weird about your traditionalism, well, then that's just a series of conversations you'd have to have. But I don't know. It depends how reasonable the person is. Okay. All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's been an hour. I got a jet. And no, Patty, one more thing. It is not the case that you must go to mass. You are required to sanctify the Lord's Day, and the normal means of doing that is the Sunday obligation. There are exceptions to the Sunday obligation, and canon law says it could be impossible to approach a Catholic minister because of moral impossibility. It doesn't define what that is, and it's not just a matter of preference. If you don't understand that, I'm sorry. Okay, I need to block you. You're annoying. All right. um, all right. Thank you, everybody. And hopefully I'll have that. I'm going to do an update on my phone. I'll have my better camera. This worked out okay, but I was really annoyed. I had all this set up ready. Okay. Like this video, subscribe to this channel, click the links in the description. This has been the Kennedy Report. Until next time, God bless.